Welcome, crypto enthusiasts, to the Independent Reserve Podcast.
Independent Reserve Podcast number 12, which I'm actually, you know what I found out today from Jared, who's behind the camera, you can't see him, but he said 87% of podcasts fail by the 11th episode. So we've been up and running longer than 87% of podcasts on Spotify.
And if we split this one into 3 consecutive episodes, we're going to do better than yet another 10 basis points.
Yes, correct. So part of history again.
Yeah.
I've been in preparation for all these episodes. I always like to do a bit of research, and I reckon I've had the most fun with yours, given how varied and diverse your background is. So normally I just kind of run through it, but I'm going to ask you. I'm going to go through each line of this, and you're going to have to give me a story as to how that came to be.
Okay.
Should I start from the beginning, or should I start from the beginning? Everyone knows Christian is the co-founder and CEO for Monoover. You bank a lot of people in the industry, and a very important player. But I have to start from the beginning, a little bit about your background, because not everyone would know that. I guess you're originally from Sweden, but you studied in the UK extensively.
Yeah.
University of York, where you did your bachelor's in politics, philosophy, and economics.
Yeah.
Got a little bit more specialised in economics with your Master of Philosophy, was it?
You really have followed up, yeah. That's
and
right.
a PhD in international relations.
Yes, that's right.
But you in payments and crypto.
I have yet to move jobs without moving continents. It's always been a big shift from one thing to the next. Very few obvious sort of traits of my current job from the last and from that one on the earlier one. So really broad brushstrokes. The professional segments were speechwriter and economic advisor in House of Lords in London for a few years while doing that PhD, which was wonderful, but it wasn't investment.
Lord Skidelsky, if I've got that
Yes, exactly right. Lord Skidelsky is an incredible sort of economic historian and historian of economic thought in particular. I joined him at a point in his career, this was in July 2008, when he thought that he was probably winding down just a little bit. A man who's done a lot, sat on different benches in the House of Lords. And so he was going to write this book of how to govern the world together with another author. And I was coming in as lowly research analyst type thing, having had some introduction somewhere. And then between July 2008, when I got the research gig, and September 2008, when I was meant to start, Lehman Brothers happened. Okay. And this idea that he was going to maybe wind down slightly and write the last book to end it all. And he's written, 20, 30, 40 books by now. Which is absolutely not going to happen anymore, because he is, in particular, an expert on Keynesianism. Mm-hmm. Keynesianism being a way of thinking about economic policy, which had been really not in fashion since maybe early 1980s or something. And with the global financial crisis, it became all of a sudden the thing again. And so whatever you thought was, belonged on a historian's shelf was now all of a sudden in the pockets of prime ministers and treasurers. And so that started a really exciting few years, working with him, doing this speechwriting and economic advising stuff. Then moved from there, happy to elaborate on anything, but just to give you the big building blocks, moved to Zimbabwe, worked in agriculture, and then came here in payments. So it's all been very distinct.
Yeah, at some point you had to leave did you ever have an interest in maybe doing more academic work? Because, PhD, you don't just sort of lightly just all the way into a PhD in international relations.
That's right. I never saw myself as an academic, but I really liked sort of intellectual pursuits. So that was always exciting. My wife is way more academic than I am. And at that point, we were doing similar-ish things at university, but she then pursued a more academic one. What I did it for was more, I said, consumption rather than investment. I think as often as you can, and one doesn't always have the luxury to make these choices, but as often as you can, you want to try to make decisions that you do for their own sake, as opposed to if I do this now, then I'll get something else later. So for me, the PhD was primarily a consumption good. I wanted to experience doing the PhD rather than thinking if I do this, then there's some amazing opportunity lined up later on. Again, you can't always live like that. Sometimes you need to study for an exam, even though it's not consumption, it's investment. You do it for something later. But I sort of thought that if I do all of this work, and took a few years to finish a PhD, and it doesn't end up giving me that one opportunity later on, will I then just look at this as a waste of time? And I didn't want that. So for me, it was a serious background to doing a few startups. So I had 3 startups, none of which worked out. But I could always point out that I was doing something serious, even though I was in startup land.
Right. So the PhD was just because you could, basically.
I was already at that university, had done my master's there already. So yeah, because I could, because I had a really interesting supervisor, and I really enjoyed spending time in Africa, and this allowed me to do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, like I said, it's a lot of work, so it's impressive. So can you give us the elevator pitch for the actual topic and what you end up writing on?
Why is it that in Africa, countries come together over and over and over again, often without reference to having done it already, to build these regional integration organizations, like wannabe European unions or ASEAN or something? And there seems to be this almost obsession with having a big summit every few years, and they declare proudly that we're going to have a customs union by, I don't know, whatever date, and we're going to have our own integrated network of highways and something. And then nothing happens. Absolutely nothing happens. And they come together again, and then nothing happens again. And they don't even talk about the last time they did the same thing. Why is that the case? So not so much why doesn't it work as why do they keep doing it, but also why is it that in 2 specific instances it actually did work? That was sort of what I was trying to figure out.
Yeah, right. Okay, so can you tell us what the answer is? Because I don't.
I mean, surprise, surprise. In most PhDs, you spend 5 years coming up with an obvious answer. So it was just, it turns out that it's not a bad thing to have great photo opportunities. That is sort of the...
It's like a virtue signaling thing, right?
It is. And if you're in a country where, and this is, it was a historical analysis as much as a current one. So I looked over the last 40, 50 years. Things have obviously changed in many parts of the continent, which is diverse and all the rest of it. But if it's something that it was called a mailbox presidency, that is, you're presidents by virtue of having the president's mailbox. You might not be in full control of the whole country. A lot of the things that we assume that a president or governor or whatever prime minister would have isn't always fair to assume in a developing context. But if you sit in government house, you are the president. So you need as many trappings as possible to strengthen that image. Right. One of them is to show up next to other presidents who also sit in government houses in other in other countries, and you shake hands, and all of a sudden you become presidential because other presidents treat you like a president.
That's fascinating. So they just kind of rock up, put on the coat, look the part, and everyone goes, "Okay, well, you're the president now." I
called it theatre integration. It was essentially theatre, and then you do it again, and it's sort of when you need a bit more. And obviously, there are so many nuances. 5 years did show me a bit more than just this, but in essence, that's it.
That is fascinating. See, I didn't know where that was going until you outlined that. When you talk about sort of economic sort of history and stuff, I know fundamentally to any sort of economic development, there needs to be sort of strong sort of property rights and these types of things, right? So whenever someone mentions sort of economic development in Africa, I kind of assume, well, it's the challenge because there's not great property rights, but you never actually thought about it's also because the people who are running the place are just there to look the part.
Well, again, this is not specifically an African issue. I would say, broadly speaking, what you need are institutions, property rights being one of them. And there are lots of other institutions that need to come together for this to work. In the absence of institutions, it turns out wherever we are in the world, that's usually what happens.
Yeah,
you end up having people for whom the best for the country and the best for yourself is not necessarily aligned. Being from Sweden, in a deeply democratic tradition, I bet that if there weren't enough checks and balances and institutions to keep a government in order, we would probably have a similar issue.
That is absolutely fascinating. Every time I now look at some presidential photos, like a photo opportunity from one of these big sort of conferences, I'm not going to look at the same way twice.
That's one of the main things.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have to go back. Actually, I think we've jumped the gun here because we have to go back to you. You're obviously originally from Sweden, but you speak, I know obviously you speak English, that's apparent, but you also speak German, Italian and Swedish. And so when you're growing up in Sweden, there were some other things about your life there that you haven't put on LinkedIn, but I've also learned about you, such as, well, apart from the many languages you speak, that you're also a very, very good pianist.
Thanks.
Such the level that I think someone described it as being a level of a concert pianist.
Who said that? I should play them all.
Got to protect my sources.
Or find more of them. But I love playing the piano. I absolutely love it. Look, obviously depends on how you define concert. I play concerts for my family every day. So yes, I'm totally a concert pianist. I started playing reasonably early. I mean, frankly, I say that. I see people here playing at 3. That was not me. But, 6 or 7 or something. What I really like about it is not just playing the piano, but playing with the piano. So I improvise. That's really the way that I use the piano. So I improvise a lot of music. I've composed a fair bit, usually for choirs.
Oh, here we go. Yep.
So that was always fun. I sang in first boys' choirs and then mixed choirs when I was younger, and always loved that. I don't really know how and when it started. I think my family was very supportive for us to try everything. I'm one of 3, and all 3 of us played the piano at one point. All 3 of us were sort of introduced to the concept of lots of different things, but the music bit really stuck with me.
Amazing. So I thought it was just being a pianist, but you're also a singer as well.
Well, that is now a long time ago. Yes.
Any other
I can sing Happy Birthday really well.
Okay, so I have to get to the bottom of this then. So, okay, concert pianist, it's up for debate. Hopefully, if someone is watching and they've heard you play, we need to get verification of this. But have you ever played professionally then? Have you been paid to play? Okay.
Never ever.
Okay, but I actually, when we caught up at the blockchain Apex, Steve Alice's DA list last week, yes,
that's right.
I did ask you that question, and the look you gave me was like, I can handle myself.
I can.
Yeah,
I can handle myself. Just I'm not sure people would pay me, but yeah.
All right. Well, this is all before we even get into the fact that you're also co-founder of a very successful payments business.
So, leaving Zimbabwe, which is where I lived before coming here, I was trying to think about what are the characteristics of the next experience, professional experience for me. Just like I had from the UK to Zimbabwe, where I didn't really have a strong sense of what industry I wanted to work with, but I knew that there were probably a few aspects of what the experience should be like that really would speak to me. So going from the UK to Zimbabwe, I wanted to work with entrepreneurs that had always spoken to me. I had my own failures behind me, but I've always liked the idea of people having ideas and trying to do something about them. I wanted to live a 2-world life to the extent that was possible. So it was very easy to go from Oxford to London, and obviously a well-trodden path, an amazing path in many ways. But it sort of felt like there was more than just the A40 that connects the two. So tried to see if there was a way of being expected and functional in two places, ideally a bit different. Ended up being Africa for me and Europe. And the third one was to work for a family-owned business. Again, longer time horizons, usually not just minding the next quarterly report. Found that was sort of the reason I came down to Zimbabwe. But when I left Zimbabwe, I said, well, what are the next things for the next move? I've never lived in Australia, never worked here, therefore. My in-laws, my wife is from here, sort of the main reason. My in-laws, supportive as they are, they're all in medicine, so it wasn't an obvious sort of network of contacts that I could draw on. But I knew I wanted to, again, work with entrepreneurs. And I wanted, to the extent possible, have a startup in a garage experience. But I also knew that we were expecting our first child. And as I said, I'd never worked here, had no contacts here. And so the idea of starting off with, hey, Angela, my wife, I'm going to earn money later. Is that okay? Was not really possible. So I looked around. I found Sydney incredibly welcoming. In the first 2-3 months, I got here in September 16. I had, 30 odd coffees, as I learned to call it. It was no longer a meeting. It was having a coffee. And with one single exception, everyone had time for the odd person who called them. In some cases, I don't know, we're often using LinkedIn, saying, I'm basically fresh off the boat. Seems like you're doing something interesting. Would love to hear more about it. And one of those people was the founder of Moneytech, a trade and network financing company based here in North Sydney, not far from where we are right now. And he had this idea of building a payments business within his business financing company. He had already got the licenses, which is obviously a big leg up, but was otherwise very hands-off. And so, I think he liked the fact that I moved to Zimbabwe and come out alive, because clearly I had no payments experience. So, but he sort of said, let's try this. And so for about 2.5 years first, it was sort of a Christian's hobby shop with some obvious support from the company itself.
So you started Monoover in 2016?
So January 17.
January 17.
January 17 we called like month 1. Okay. But it was still all under our old branding at that point. In fact, Monoover as a brand celebrates 5 years on Monday.
Oh, amazing.
So 5th of August 2019. So about 2.5 years, sort of experimenting with the concepts that now very much form what is Monoova. And then by 2019, we were so different from Monotech, in itself a very successful business, but very, very different. And yeah, we've never looked back. We're now a fully spun off independent company. We service lots of tech companies like yourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. How long have you been working? Because again, sort of, I guess the early days of Independent Reserve, very much that sort of tech founder, entrepreneurial kind of vibe, which is, I guess, your bread and butter. That's exactly the type of people you're looking for.
Yeah. So we're 75 odd people. I'd say 30 or so are in engineering in some shape or form, maybe product and engineering. I'm myself, I'm not an engineer, but I understand what we need enough to get a sense of what probably should happen. And you can, if you understand the product concept well enough, I think you can ask the right questions, but obviously you need the experts to actually do the building.
Incredible. And so what are those, some of the, obviously there must have been like a million learnings along the way during that time. I guess if someone was looking to, what have been the biggest learnings along the way? What's the biggest differences perhaps from when you first started to the way the business has come out now that you never would have seen coming that people would be interested to hear?
So in January 17, obviously behind the scenes, people were already working on real-time payments and had been doing that for a little while. I had no idea. Again, I've been growing bananas in Tanzania before coming here. But the difference in what was possible then, actually from January 17 to what is possible now, is incredible. It is sort of a fax machine to iPhone experience. And for a company like Monoova, the more the infrastructure can handle, the more we can add value on top of it. You can only do so much if payments move every 2-3 hours and only on weekdays and so on. I mean, the improvements on top of that are probably quite cosmetic. Whereas when things can move all the time, really fast, really securely, data rich, and all the rest of it, then there's so much more you can do. And what we found was that companies like Independent Reserve, a number of other organizations in your industry, but also in the broader fintech world, we're not serving DCs exclusively by any stretch of imagination. But what we found was that these fintechs, remitters, DCs, and others, while you don't have unique problems, you're uniquely good at solving problems. Yeah. Because, I mean, when we talk to the slightly sort of higher end or bigger end of town, more established businesses, we spend a lot of time usually even arriving at the idea that there might be a problem with having 100 people in accounts payables. And that there's something strange about moving information at one speed and money at a very different speed. When we talk to people like you guys, you API your breakfast and get really annoyed that you can't automate your toothbrushing. So the whole first, the first 2-3 years of conversations don't have to happen because they already happen in your mind. Yeah, absolutely. And then you're also often very, very fast at giving feedback, and you don't just take things as is. So we release a new API endpoint, and one of you will call us and go, "You guys are idiots. Semicolon should have been a comma. You knew that." And we feel really embarrassed, and the whole team, comes together, and we sit through the night and we change it from a semicolon to a comma or something. Yeah. But the next day, it's released, product is better, and you guys, you know what? Actually, we had the same issue 2 years ourselves, or 2 months ago ourselves. You sell to a large ASX listed business. They're not going to comment on your code. They're going to take it. This either works or it doesn't work. And so working with fintechs, so we've been able to generate good customer experiences, both for our clients and for their customers, but also actually evolving our product in a way that makes it what it is today. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's true. Necessity is the mother of all invention. And so new businesses, they're finding they've got necessity all the time. And so they have to survive, they have to innovate, they have to be quick, they have to be nimble. Where you can, like you're right, you can get away with not doing that if you're a big organization because you just do what you've always done. And there's probably not the same necessity to really innovate. But also, it's not just a necessity, it's probably obstacles. Even if you have some real innovation champions inside, put yourself in the position of a procurement manager of a large telco here. So procurement manager sits in front of 2 options, Monoova or Big Four bank. A procurement manager who happens to be one of those API for breakfast type people goes, I can't get webhooks. I can't get 100 things that I want from the Big Four bank. Monoova has that. Okay, so that's good. But if something happens in the next 2-3 years, someone's going to say, "Who the hell chose Monoova? What is that company anyway?" So even though it has a superior product, and you have had 2-3 years or better, the day something happens or someone doesn't understand something, whatever, then you'll lose your job there. Whereas if you're choosing a big four bank with possibly an inferior product, then you're safe.
Yeah.
But we see that changing though. We see. And that's not a slight on anyone. It's just that incentive structures, risk functions, and what people need to take into account. I mean, for a smaller business, reputation risk is almost non-existent. For a large organization, it's probably one of the largest risks around. And one of the many things that have shifted is not just the infrastructure that's behind it. It's that whereas maybe until a few years ago, you were either a digitally native business or you were not. But those distinctions are phased out. I mean, how many companies do you know who call themselves an electricity native company? Very few. Even though at some point there were some companies that were electricity natives. We use electricity. Wow, cool. Well, we won't do that quite yet. We'll have a few committees to go through, but at some point maybe we'll switch off the kerosene. But at some point every company is electricity native, and then therefore you stop talking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the same thing is happening now with digitally native. Sooner or later, no one's going to call themselves digitally native. Just like no one goes around and say, "I'm literate." And it's sort of assumed, right?
So exactly right. Yeah, it's the a lot of this technology is ultimately, I guess, a tool, and people kind of adopt it. Once everyone adopts it, it's just a thing that everyone uses. It's a great example. I had a question on that, but it just slipped my mind. But I'll come back to it if I remember it. Actually, before something popped into mind that I really wanted to ask you about was your time in Zimbabwe, the actual climate, because obviously Zimbabwe as a country's had its challenges during the period you're there. So you were there pre-2016. What was the actual conditions there like? Were you part of it? Were you there when they had the issue with the farming takeovers and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I was there from about halfway through 2013 until halfway through 2016. So 3 years. And the beginning bit had a lot of optimism that maybe the end bit did not. But we were there in a short snippet, my wife and I, of a obviously much longer sort of narrative or set of developments. So Zimbabwe has a really poor reputation. And in some cases, that's absolutely warranted. But in so many ways, when you say someone has a poor reputation, it's usually to imply that it's maybe not entirely deserved. Zimbabwe is an incredible country. Obviously has struggled somewhat with lack of institutions. Now, we could turn it into a Zimbabwean history podcast, or we could choose to just summarize things a little bit. But essentially, by 1997, Zimbabwe was doing incredibly well and probably going out on a limb a little bit, but would certainly compete with South Africa for GDP per capita and a few other things. Until a few years ago, Zimbabwe was still the most literate country in Africa. And then sort of the density of accountants and lawyers to the broader population was the highest around. And you sort of need that density of professional services to make companies work. So that was there. But between 97 and 2000, there were a few sort of adventurous escapades by the Mugabe government, sending tanks up to Eastern Congo that needed to be paid for. How do you pay for it? Well, you start printing money. And then when you started having hyperinflation, the sort of middle class started to get a bit disenfranchised, even though you might have liberated the country from minority rule 20 years ago. For a middle class, Zimbabwean middle class in the late 90s, they were thinking about educational outcomes. They weren't thinking about what happened to Bush in 1979. And so started losing a bit of that support. And a good way of shoring up support is to point fingers. And so you started pointing fingers at the productive parts of the economy, which were the farmers. Most of them white, which in itself needed to be addressed. You had 3,500 farmers who owned a very, very large portion of the agricultural economy. But that all happened sort of early 2000s. That's when that properly starts. By 2008, you have hyperinflation going into, I think it's the second or third worst hyperinflation in world history, or at least in British history. Hungarian, German, and Zimbabwean from memory. But we end up in 2013. We're in 2013 when we show up. So this is all already history. And at that point, there had been dollarization. So you used US dollars instead of Zimbabwean dollars.
Yeah.
But lots, I mean, in Zimbabwe, every person was an FX trader. You'd go and buy tomatoes, and you hear teenagers or younger still saying, you know what, if I'll give you 2 clean US dollar bills and 1 dirty US dollar bill and 5 South African rands for those tomatoes. And the person goes, I want 3 clean ones, but I'll give you 2 pula from Botswana back. And they go, okay, that's fine.
That's
okay.
fascinating.
And it's every interaction, because a dirty bill you can't use outside of Zimbabwe. You can't even go to Zambia and buy something with it.
Right.
Whereas a clean bill, obviously internationally recognized, so everyone was trading. 2013, it sort of settled a bit. And it was also the tail end, as it turned out, of the government of national unity. So you had Morgan Tsvangirai, who was the opposition leader, together with Mugabe. But already a few months after we moved, the government of national unity fell apart. It was now Mugabe on his own again. And that optimism that we saw in 2013 was evaporating pretty quickly.
Right.
And my understanding, but to be clear, I haven't actually been back since 16. Sorry, we lots of really close contacts, and my children have Shauna middle names, but I haven't been there. But I understand the development hasn't been just positive.
Oh, that's a real shame.
It's an incredible country, and I recommend everyone going there.
That's fascinating. So it's fascinating that I guess that your interests lie in politics, philosophy, and economics, and that there's probably no better and African politics to a certain extent, specifically about the political theatre, I think you called. And then there you were in Zimbabwe, kind of. It was all coming together.
That's true, but by total happenstance, like this, I don't think I got the job because I had done the PhD. But I think the fact that there was sort of a latent variable behind the two, right? That I wanted to spend time doing the research in Africa. I had lived briefly in Mozambique, taught panel data econometrics at the University of Maputo at one point. And here was an opportunity to join this company. So it's Africa we speak of so easily as one somehow more or less uniform place. It's obviously incredibly diverse as every other place. But the parts that I've seen are parts I want to go back to. That's
incredible. Sorry to keep jumping around because I originally we were talking about, I guess, payments infrastructure and something.
That's true.
Back onto Zimbabwe.
So, I mean, to tie it into Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is a true leapfrog story. You go from carrying bits of metal and really torn paper in your pocket to then using what is the biggest brand. There's EcoCash, where everyone has heard of M-Pesa. That sort of started as a mobile phone wallet in Kenya, and now exists in lots of parts. Where instead of paying you money, because it was really expensive to carry, but also dangerous possibly to carry along lots of cash if you work in one part of the country and you want to send it home. So instead I started sending you mobile phone credits. Like, I'm not going to give you money, but I'm giving you 50 minutes on your phone. And you said, that's great. Okay. And then you can actually start using those 50 minutes.
Back to a kind of barter system.
As a currency.
Yeah. Well, I guess it comes back to the question
and
of
the
what
same
is
thing
money, right?
In Zimbabwe,
what is money? I guess that fits naturally into, obviously Independent Reserve is a crypto exchange, and we're obviously very close with the whole idea of crypto and what is money and all this type of stuff. It would be anyone in Zimbabwe actually adopting? Because it's actually really fascinating to see people who are adopting crypto as a way to actually trade, because I presume everyone's got access to the internet. But are they still using, what are they predominantly using there for the moment? Is it mostly US dollar, or are they starting to use other
It's
forms
changed
of money?
Again. So even in the last 2-3 years, there have been further shifts. There was an introduction of a Zimbabwean currency that wasn't called that. It was called a bond dollar. Anyway, got all very complicated again. People are using this EcoCash, which is a privately owned wallet, a lot. And there are other versions of that. I, to be honest, don't know the extent to which cryptocurrencies are used. We know that in other inflation-prone environments like Argentina, cryptocurrencies have had a lot of support, because you go, do I trust in some kind of decentralized node technology that I maybe don't understand, but it doesn't seem like it's in the hands of my Reserve Bank governor? Or do I trust the Reserve Bank governor? And often people go, I'm not sure about the Reserve Bank governor. And so it wouldn't surprise me. Zimbabweans are usually, as I said, very well educated. And so you could, like, if you run around town in Harare for no fault of the individual, you'll see hawkers selling you, phone credits, for instance. If you ask that person who's Jane Austen, at least when we were there, it's not at all unlikely that they have some sense. I think it's an author, maybe English. You ask a person in Maputo who's also selling phone credit, that they might not be able to read and write. I'm very, very stereotyping here, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if Zimbabwe had been pretty quick on some of the new technology.
Technologies. Yeah, right. That's we really could talk about that all day, I guess. That's absolutely fascinating. But back maybe to sort of Monoover, what are some of the key challenges you guys are sort of working through at the moment, broadly as a business and in the payment space?
I mean, the challenge is having a business. It's like being a business is always a challenge. Yep. As I'm sure you will know, the highs are really high, the lows are very low, and they're not more than 3 minutes apart. Right? It's I think the whole concept, people who tell me, I had a good day or a good week, I was like, what is that? I have like good 15 minutes followed by complicated 15 minutes. So far, I'd say this has been a good 20 minutes, maybe, or something. You're extending it. Yeah, exactly. So it goes up and down very quickly. The challenges are, I think, a few. One is, it's really easy to turn API-driven payments automation into the most boring conversation in the world. Like, even just saying that sentence makes you yawn a little bit, at least inside.
Inside a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I do it too. And so how do you get a story across where what we do becomes relatable? It shouldn't be that hard for payments, right? Because by the time I meet someone in the morning who is not my wife or my 2 children, probably they've paid for something. They've been on a bus, they bought a coffee.
Something most people just take for granted.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's actually a bit like agriculture. It is something we interact with on a daily basis, and very few of us have any sense of how tea bush becomes a tea bag.
Yep.
Or how that tap becomes, a train ticket or something. So it's inherent in payments, the ubiquity of it, that you can make really minor improvements turn into very large impact. But there's always a challenge in getting that across to the right people at the right time. I said also, Monoova, we're asking our clients to trust us with 2 things that very few people want to trust anyone with, let alone 75 people from Sydney. And that is people's money. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're asking our clients to trust us with their money, even if in some cases only for 2 seconds. And we're asking our clients to trust us with their operational integrity. Because we're not, to be very clear, I know you used the word bank, we bank DCs. We don't bank DCs, we support on the payment side. But let's say that you're a bank. If you go down, that has big implications, and the reputational bit comes in pretty quickly. But most businesses can probably still operate throughout that day because their bank account is usually not built into their ERP system or their customer service offering. Monoova goes down, which, to be clear, hasn't happened now for a very, very, very long time. Our clients can't get paid.
Yep.
And if you are an investment platform, it doesn't have to be digital assets. It could be, we support share investment platforms, we support carbon credit platforms, we support remittance platforms, lots of other ones. Payments are a pretty important part of that stuff. Very important. Like, it's not like, you know what, I'll do the rest of my remittance today and I'll do the payments later. No, the payments is the remittance. The investment is a payment at some level. So we're asking our clients to do that. What's changed, and this is becoming less and less of a challenge, but it's still there, is how do we engender that trust? How do we earn the trust? And the fact we've been around now for 7.5 years in total, but 5 as Monoova, the fact that we're moving as much money as we are on a daily basis even, the fact of the partnerships we have, the fact that we're serving some very large, in some cases, international brands, all of that, I think it makes it easier for us now than it once was, but we should never ever assume that that's just taken for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, particularly as an exchange, I guess, from a cryptocurrency point of view, we kind of exist as the bridge between the regular banking world, if you want, for want of a better term, and the cryptoverse. Yeah. And we sit kind of that bridge. So we need to have a solid foot in both camps, really, to provide what we do. And the biggest confusing part for most people, oddly enough, is not the crypto side, but even for people who are relatively new to crypto, it's the payment and the banking side, from getting money to an exchange. Not because of any restrictions of going to an exchange or anything like that, but because they don't always understand that EFTs, for example, are not instant. People are so used to, using Visa or something like that, where you can just tap and off you go. Yeah. They don't realize that there's the plumbing and infrastructure underneath that is actually, there's a lot of moving parts, and it takes time. Money doesn't actually move instantly in most cases. And
nothing makes us more nervous as consumers than that moment in time when you've handed over something and you haven't got something in return. Right? And which is, again, where the difference between what was possible when we all got started in 2017 and what we can do now is huge. But still, there's a degree of nervousness. Wait, I'm going to give you this. And that's where it matters that Independent Reserve has been around for many years, maybe as long as we have by now, 27. Actually, Absolutely. Longer, actually. Sorry. Yeah. Adrian obviously started even
2013.
Yeah, so 4 years older than we are. It matters that you've been around.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you probably Google a bit and try to find out what other people are saying. And having that reputation, you can't build a reputation in one day. You build it over time. And that's where people start to feel comfortable. But that's where payments is an inherently poor experience for everyone.
Yep.
I mean, again, you part with something you don't want to part with, right?
Yep.
That's the experience for the buyer or the consumer. Yep. I don't want to give you this.
Yep.
But okay.
Yeah.
And for the merchant, because it is such a bad experience, you want to make it as easy as possible. At the same time, you want to make sure that money actually is coming into your hand and not sort of staying in the middle somewhere.
Yeah.
So if you can do that, if you can turn the payment experience into something that's an integral part of the good customer experience, as opposed to just a sideshow we need to get through to get to the real stuff, then you're probably onto something, because that is what makes people nervous.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, you've got the challenge that everyone just expects it to work, and they don't have any appreciation for how much has to go right for it to be a smooth experience. And so you kind of have to go and what's the word I'm looking for? Somehow to impress somebody in payments, you have to do something really special.
But then very quickly, something that was impressive becomes just normal. So in the early days of the 2019 type stuff for us with MPP, the Real-Time Payments Network, it was super cool.
Yeah.
Wow. I paid. Oh, you got it? That's amazing. But then by 2021, everyone's like, yeah, of course, whatever. What else can you do? Because really quickly.
Actually, it reminds me of Louis C.K., the comedian, did an awesome piece on this, and he was sort of saying this exact thing he pointed out. He's talking about how when the Wi-Fi or whatever first went into airplanes, and he's thinking about how amazing that is, going, well, now you can jump on a plane, and you can, in 7 hours, you could do what, our forefathers or whatever would take 7 months to do and might die along the way.
Yeah.
And you just take it for granted. And he was taking the point now that he goes, well, and for example, now they have Wi-Fi, and to make it even more of a pleasurable experience. And he goes, the person sitting next to me logged on, he goes, oh, there's Wi-Fi. And then he clicked it and it didn't work. And he's like, this piece of shit.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, our expectations change very quickly, but
so quickly.
But we also know that, we all play different parts. So when I jump on a train, I'm assuming it's going to work. The fact that it can travel at, 40 kilometers an hour across the Sydney Harbour Bridge doesn't impress me anymore. Yeah. If it travels at 10 kilometers an hour because some signal error in Redfern, I get upset. All so, right. So we're all prone to exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We raise our expectations, and once expectations are up, they're going to go even higher. And the question, how do you meet them?
Yeah. Well, so what's the next evolution then? What's the wish list then for Monoova to be that next iteration that wows everybody, that everyone quickly gets used to and expects?
Yeah, exactly. I think we created a first few benchmarks in what to expect. And this sounds very salesy all of a sudden, but like our automatcher, that real-time reconciliation of real-time receipts, we were first with that, and that's used everywhere now. It's become really industry standard. We see our good friends amongst the competitors doing the same thing. We're proud of having done that. PayTo, to me, is something that's already off the ground. Obviously, Monoova plays a very large part. We're 60% plus of all activity on PayTo right now.
Actually, before we go on, can you explain? PayTo is really fascinating because it's kind of the next generation. Yeah. Thought you might be. Yeah. And I think it's like most people I speak to, I was surprised that so few people that I speak to, they might be completely fluent in crypto, but really actually go, this whole banking thing, I don't quite understand it, or not quite fully understand.
Which is fair. I mean, I'm a payments person. I'm not a crypto person. So there'll be tons of times when I come across something that I've probably been next to, but I haven't really looked at properly. So PayTo in its simplest expression is a real-time data-rich version of direct debit.
Yeah. Okay.
It is safer. It has more consumer control. There are so many good things. But if you just want to make it super simple, think of a direct debit as in, I'm a subscription service provider, Netflix, and normally I use direct debit, and it takes things off a bank account, and it takes me 2 to 3 days to find out whether did Lee actually have his $14.70 or not. And after 2-3 days, if I haven't heard from the bank telling me he didn't, I can assume that you did.
You did, yeah.
But that's a bad experience for you. It's a bad experience as the consumer. It's a bad experience for Netflix. PayTo does that this way. So in Monoover's case, about 2.3 seconds, you will not only have found out was the money there or not, you'll also have the money with you, and it's cleared and settled. So you don't have to. There's no sort of dishonor risk later on or anything like that. But my mind, and I obviously would say this as someone who spent a bit of time on PayTo, it's the same. Do you remember last time you didn't tap and go when you were asked and about?
Yep.
You do? Yep. It's not that common. I mean, tap and go is usually when you don't tap and go is usually a machine is not working.
Oh, right. So you mean pull out the phone, tap on it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, when someone says, actually, can you swipe instead? Or can you chip and pin? It's usually a sign something isn't working.
Right. I can't remember the last time that happened. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. I think my view is that PayTo will have a similar impact online as tap and go did offline. So offline, if you don't tap and go, you go, wait, something is broken.
Yeah, right.
Online, I think, and there are some caveats around this, and some of them very well known, but by and large, within a few years, if you don't PayTo online, what happened here?
Yeah, right.
Machine isn't working.
Yeah,
the online checkout isn't quite there.
Yeah.
So PayTo has huge application, and but we're in the very, very early phases, and a lot of it has to do with education. As you say, not many people know about PayTo, and that's fair enough. As you said earlier, technology is in itself pretty boring. It's what you can do with it that matters. What's the impact of it? How does it make my life a bit better? And I think PayTo will make a lot of people's lives a little bit better.
And we'll all get used to it. You notice it when you go to places like the States, where the States is obviously a first world country. You go there and you have to swipe everything, you have to sign. You're like, where have I gotten to?
Yeah.
We get so used to it in Australia because you have your PayU on your phone these days, and you just tap and go everything. And I jumped on a plane to go to Dubai for token. This year, sorry. And I completely forgot that. Hang on, maybe not everyone can just tap and go. And I was going, oh shit, I haven't brought any cards. I didn't
bring my checkbook.
Like, what happens if I get there and I can't do anything? I'm going to be completely boned. Unfortunately, they did. But like, if I had that same thing, if I had to realize I was going to the US without bringing a physical card or something, I would have been. I wouldn't have been able to pay for most things. Yeah,
that's true. So I think PayTo will have a big impact. Monoova is a really, really early mover on that. I said we're 60% plus of all activity on PayTo. I think it puts us in a good stead. We don't expect we'll keep 60% of the market for very long. As the market grows, there will be some very large players entering, big four bank type players. And we think that's actually a good thing. It's just that making it something that people expect means it's just better for everyone, sort of with the rising tide type thing. But having more experience of PayTo than anyone else and everyone else combined at this point, I think is exciting for us. I think beyond that, Australia, by virtue of its geography, is very binary. You're either in Australia or you're not in Australia. Now, that might seem like surely that's the place everywhere, unless you're sort of Schrodinger's cat or something. But you're either in Australia or you're not. But if you are in Sweden, for instance, sure, I'm usually aware of what country I'm in. But every local train station would here be called an international train station, because I can always take a train somehow to Oslo or to Copenhagen. And if I walk far enough picking berries in Western Sweden, I might actually find myself in Norway. And if you live in the Benelux, you can walk from one part of a cafe to the next, and you cross through Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg within 3 mochaccino's. It's really fast. But in Australia, because it's so far away from most other things,
isolated.
I think it sort of permeates a bit of the way we look at how sort of the world works, including payments. So sort of tying back to what you're saying, you're either paying someone here or you're paying someone very different. If they're not in New Zealand, then how can we trust them? But that, I think, we're seeing a lot of change there already. I mean, obviously, there's some obvious long trends here, but my sense is that what we'll start seeing, and a next iteration for Monoova, but it's probably not literally the next, it's probably the one after that or something like that, is being part of an international network of Monoovers. So we're here and only
Monoova, is that Monoova global expansion or Monoova like businesses?
Monoova like businesses elsewhere. Yeah. I think other than the ego boost of putting up brass plaques with our name all over the place, frankly, the value add of starting from scratch in other jurisdictions where there are people who are doing that really, really well. I have an interest in obviously convincing those other Monoovers out there of the same thing here. Don't put up a brass plaque. Work with us. But I think there's a large play where you combine companies like Monoova with other Monoovers in other jurisdictions and make it very easy for people in Australia to transact with people who are not here, and likewise people who are not here to transact with people in Australia. And we're starting to see that as well. So I can over time I can see how we become globally relevant, not by being everywhere, but being able to service everywhere.
Gotcha. Is that will we see you at events like sort of Token in Singapore and a place like that? Are they sort of good hunting grounds for the crypto focus ones? Probably not so much.
Look, because we're not ourselves a digital assets business, we're not on the blockchain. The one caveat to that was we were one of very, very few, one of 14 companies selected by the RBA for their CBDC pilot. We were very, very proud of that. There weren't many companies our size. Most of them were Big Four banks, MasterCard and similar. There are some noted exceptions. Not centralized was there.
Sorry, I completely forgot to mention Monoova was the 2022 fintech of the year.
Oh, I forgot too. Yay!
So no surprise you're in part of this. And runner-up 3 times. Oh, so shortlisted 3 times.
So for being fintech organization of the year, that was I think we were in a shortlist once. If you can even be on a shortlist on that one, maybe you can. Yes, and we won it, which we were very happy about. But then it's just in my own capacity, I've been on very shortlists and haven't quite won yet. But feel like a winner by being on the shortlist.
Absolutely,
I'm proud enough of it to have it on LinkedIn. So what was I saying? Oh yeah, so Token probably not the right place for us. Yeah. Not that I wouldn't love going, but if I have to prioritize, which I do. Much more likely to go to Singapore FinTech Festival.
The FinTech Festival,
where
of course,
we've been now a few times. Money 2020 in Amsterdam. Obviously Intersect here in Australia, which is a great event. But then because so many of our clients are moving in a digital assets world, we go to the Blockchain APAC and Blockchain Australia, and it's fascinating to see the changes there. I don't know if you remember, but Blockchain Week by Blockchain Australia, Steve Ellis's was the 2022 event when they had like Quantum Central and a few different places, and there was ASX.
I remember that.
That was a very different discussion. Sam Bankman-Fried, whatever his name is.
That's right.
He was
sponsored that one.
He sponsored that one. It was a very different conversation to the year after, and very different again to this year.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to see who ends up being OG. I mean, you guys. You not only have been around since 2013, but being at DCE is a little bit old school by now.
It is.
At one point, it was like the cutting edge. But if you're not a DAO, then what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
You need to. So it's interesting to see how something that is in itself so cutting edge has all these subcultures that are even more cutting edge.
Absolutely.
And you see that at these events, and it's always helpful for us to understand the industries in which our clients move. And so we'll continue to show up, but probably more of the more general fintech-y type events.
I'll tell you a story. So back in 2021, obviously it was a different market then. It was just coming off the back of the last kind of peak of the last bull run. And at the end of 2021, I was sitting down with LP, who pretty much everyone in the digital asset world knows. We sat down and said, well, let's plan our 2022 ahead. Of course, we didn't have any idea what 2022 held at that point, but we sat down and we listed out, I guess, the main things we wanted to achieve in terms of like new business and revenues and all this kind of stuff. And of course, 2022 happened. And by the end of that year, the main business segments that we were looking at and the main people who were now sort of, I guess, interesting from a DCE perspective weren't even on our roadmap. So within 12 months, all the new business we have wasn't even on our awareness.
Yeah, that's right.
Of 2021, just to show you how quickly it moves.
Absolutely.
And now those businesses that were kind of like, these all people are new coming into the digital asset space and using, particularly sort of stable coins for sort of international payment and this type of stuff is now, it's only 3 years ago or 2 years ago, really. And it's kind of like, they've been around forever.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, do you remember what an ICO is? Like,
No.
exactly.
No.
Right? And that was the thing.
That was the thing. That's
for
right.
a while. And it took a long time for the broader public, myself included, to distinguish between not just crypto and other things, but Bitcoin. Like, what's the difference between, I don't know, Bitcoin and crypto? And then maybe taking one more leap, which is crypto and blockchain. And then all these things happen. And if you want to sound really smart, you'll say something, and this is like in 2022, you'll say something like, you know what, I have my concerns about Bitcoin, but I do believe in blockchain technology.
That's right.
As if they were necessarily statements that had to belong together.
Yeah. Correct.
And they are, it's like an application of technology and technology in some ways. And so I just find that the conversation, broadly speaking, is much more sophisticated, which is unsurprising. I mean, from 2009 to now, I mean, that's the entirety of this universe. That's what, 15 years. So of course, lots of things change in 5.
It's becoming far more nuanced, and the applications are becoming far more apparent and being built out. For example, if you want to sound in the know right at the moment, you'd start talking about real world tokenization.
Yep, a lot.
Yep. Putting things on the blockchain, right? Which is
houses.
Which it's a fancy word of saying, well, like NFTs were all the big rage back in, say, 2021. And NFTs are kind of derided as this stupid thing where you trade monkey JPEGs and all this kind of stuff. Okay, probably that was silly. But the actual application of tokenizing something, someone kind of went, oh, well, you know what, actually we can tokenize a real world thing. And that actually allows us to move the ownership and the value of this thing, whatever it represents in the real world, seamlessly near free with complete reliability. So the tokenization of your house, of course, you still own your house, but the record of ownership, instead of being on a title deed somewhere in a government office somewhere, now is on an immutable ledger. But it gets back to the thing about that we were talking before about just the nature of technology. Eventually, and I keep saying this to people, they're like, oh, what's all this crypto business? And they'll talk about, you know, Dogecoin or Shiba Inu, or it's like these random meme coins that have just kind of captured the public imagination, but don't really mean too much. But I say, well, look, you know, by the time you're using crypto, you won't know it. It'll just be on an app on your phone with a QR code, and you're signing over the registration of your car. So there's a record of now who owns your car, as opposed to having to fill out the paper-based thing to do it. But you'll just see it as a tap and go thing.
Which comes back to what we said earlier. Technology is not in itself that interesting.
That's right.
I mean, for a small group of people, it's fascinating. It's what we devote our lives to. But for everyone else, it's not that interesting. But it's what you can do with it, and understanding what the value is. And the value is very rarely the sort of messianic saving the world type of thing. Yep. Even though that, you know, the hard believers in any technological advance will think this will make the world a better place, and sometimes it does. But it's often that, you know, the moniker that we tend to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. And I think that's the case here too.
Absolutely. There's so many great examples of people, and AI is probably another thing that's kind of happening now, where there's a tremendous misallocation on over-resourcing of various new things because they haven't quite worked out where it fits in the whole scheme of things. A great example is the old pets.com. When the internet was, everyone kind of realized, well, the internet's going to be huge. And, you know, websites is going to be amazing. You have businesses and all this cool stuff. And there was a big gold rush for the domain name. So pets.com or whatever sold back in the late 90s for 300 million or something crazy because it got a squillion clicks. But they didn't work out that, no, it's not the domain. The domain is helpful, but Amazon showed that it's actually the business that's using the technology to, it's the business that's valuable. No one was rushing out to collect Amazon.com for the domain. And I'm sure Jeff Bezos didn't pay $300 million for that domain, but he did create quite more than a $300 million business.
Elon Musk paid something big for X.com, and he finally found a business to attach it to.
What's his fascination with X? Because he just says he likes X. There's something about the X that gets his blood running.
I mean, it seems to be running very, very quickly.
How many kids has he got now?
God knows.
I don't know. I guess with some of the new technology, like the DLT, it's not blockchain, it's now called DLT. That seems to be the cool, the more, what's the word, corporate acceptable. It gets away from crypto. Okay, it's all the same thing. Real world tokenization of assets is the fancy word for NFTs now. But let's not call them NFTs, we'll call them RWAs. But anyway, the technology, the DLT technology, is there any, I guess, is Monoover looking at using any of that type of technology in its own sort of tech stack?
Not for the sake of. To be clear, we are at the moment using centralized technology.
We use centralized technology. We're a crypto business. And
as opposed to decentralized. There's no Web3 in our stack. But but it's not an ideological statement. I'm not saying that's because we are vehemently opposed to using it or anything else. We would use any technology that we think creates the experience that we want to create for our clients. And in some cases, I'm sure there is decentralized technology out there that will do that. We just haven't got around to it.
Yep.
In other cases, it's probably where we understand what we're good at and what others are good at. So Monoova, we don't have sort of an imperial mindset that we think just because we're really good at payments, you ought to be good at all these other things too.
No,
we think we're good at payments, and then our clients are usually excellent at whatever they're doing, whether that is a DCE, we service expense management apps, we service travel companies. Like, they know their field really, really well. And we just want to make sure that they can do that full time rather than worrying about payments half the time.
Yeah.
But if there was Web3 technology that could support us behind the scenes, I'm sure there is someone in our team looking at it already.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, to be honest, that kind of response doesn't surprise me too much. I think, where as a DCE, we have to be a centralized technology to be able to operate at the speed we do. In very simplistic terms, I know the tech guys have always sort of said, if you need something fast, you kind of need to centralize. And if you need something robust, then you can decentralize. And it just depends on the application or the business problem that you're trying to solve as to which one makes sense.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. There's always some gold, and I know I did a bit of prying, and but there's always something about our guests that I always never quite get out until the end.
Okay.
Something about life as a young boy in Sweden, or something you've done that's actually that you're really into that no one knows about, and I got to dig that out of you.
I really like when things are a little bit unexpected, and you can find that in all kinds of environments. But I think the way that I have moved, so physically, geographically, would suggest that there's very little path dependence between where I grew up in central Stockholm and the different places I've lived since then, including now in Sydney. I am usually someone who I'm always someone who loves cities because of that unexpected component. If you live in a city, you don't really know whom you're going to run into and what the experiences are going to be. The more manicured the experience, the less unexpected and the less enriching, I think it is. But you can also find unexpected experiences, obviously, in nature. And so, stories that I've dined out on from my Zimbabwe years was once I woke up underneath an elephant. And another time I was charged by a buffalo at 2 a.m. On the Zambezi escarpment and fled up a tree.
So you're a naturist. Is that the word?
I like that sounds like
on the weekend we'll see you with the
I think
boots
that's
on,
like stuff people do in Berlin in the central parks. No, no. I love being in nature properly.
Right.
Like
the camper, you go camping, and
not if camping means sleeping on a car park, because I find that's often what camping is.
So you like to get off the grid.
I like when you dig for your own water type camping.
Oh wow, right. What's the most wild you've got? Have you done like what's it called? Like, I don't know. Have you done some epic trails?
I think the walk.
Stuff?
I did a 5-day walk down the Zambezi escarpment in northern Zimbabwe, where we were walking with lions, not too many tens of meters that way, and elephants, not too many tens of meters that way. And we're only 4 of us.
Right.
Nothing obviously man-made around us. So that was probably the wildest. We had to have a satellite phone with us because there was no reception either. And that was the thing that ended up with me being charged by buffalo in the middle of the night.
How did you escape?
Well, I mentioned the tree, but also we had another person, my friend, who was infinitely braver, but also armed with a gun, who ran the other way towards the buffalo, and by sheer force of attitude,
right,
got the buffalo to think this is too much of a hassle.
Really,
it's a skinny Swede. I'm not going to chase him anymore. I'm going to go the other way.
Yeah, right. So how often are you getting out at the moment? I guess you got a young family, so it's a bit harder.
Yeah, it's a bit harder. There is a part of Australia, so many parts of Australia I'd like to visit, but one that really captured my imagination. So at one point, Antarctica in Australia was one big continent, part of an even larger continent. And it was slightly further north to where Antarctica is now. And there was a big forest that covered the whole area. And at some point, Antarctica went further south, got too dry but too cold. And Australia went too far north, too dry and too hot. And there is this bit of Tasmania that has just the right climate. It is wet enough and it is the right temperature. And it's southwestern tip of Australia. and it has one of the oldest forests around. And outside of Oregon, Washington, and sort of the redwood trees on the American West Coast, it has some of the tallest trees in the world as well.
That's right. I've heard about this. Yes,
and it's supposed to be spectacular. And you have these forest lobsters that are, running between one brook and the next on land, and apparently they're quite large because there are very few predators. And their wallabies are 30% bigger because, again, there aren't predators. And it must feel like a particularly crazy part in a pretty crazy continent. That would be a next one for me.
What's it called? Yes, I've had lots of friends who've gone hiking and stuff, and they spend days and weeks trekking up and down it.
Yeah, and it's sort of mountain mist forests type style.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone talks about it. Cradle Mountain. Is it Cradle Mountain?
I think Cradle Mountain is a bit more established and slightly further north, but I might be wrong on this. But anyway, if there's a place without a road and lobsters climbing 100-meter trees, that sounds like a pretty cool place to go.
I've heard all about it. I've got a friend, he told me a story because he was telling me this. It doesn't sound pleasant at all. He had gone hiking there with his, then fiance, and they were up and down thing. But he said this horrible story where the day before he went, he was near the campfire and he burned his feet. So he was hiking with kind of like semi-burnt feet. But of course, if that was more painful enough, then it rained the entire time. So he was soaking wet with his feet that were being burnt the night before. And that was his experience of the old growth forest in Tasmania.
So the lesson is, don't burn your feet.
Don't burn your feet. Yeah. That's amazing. All right. Well, thank you very much. Hey, Christian. So one of the things that I mentioned before, part of the reason we wanted to get people along to do sort of this podcast was to sort of showcase, really interesting people working in this space, sort of behind the scenes. And payments is obviously a very large part of the reason we can have a Bitcoin and crypto industry in Australia, to which you're a very critical part, and Monoover is a very critical part of that whole infrastructure. But I guess not many people would know just how interesting and diverse your background is. But I hope now people can see the quality and the depth of people who take on these challenges to create new industries and create better experiences for customers, of which you're deeply a part. So thank you very much for taking part of it.
Thank you.
All right, awesome.
Independent Reserve, the trusted cryptocurrency exchange.